You're listening to The Outcue, a 21 News journalist perspective on a top news story.
Good afternoon. It is Friday, October 25th. I'm Assistant News Director Justin Mitchell, and this is The Outcue. This week, what we're going to talk about is when you're ahead on a story, which sounds like a win, and of course it is a win in a newsroom. You want to be ahead on a story. You want to be the first person to tell the audience about something. But it's not that easy, and it comes with a lot of worry, anxiety, a lot of meticulous work. And so with me today to discuss what that feels like and the roller coaster of emotion that goes into it, as well as how hard it is to do, we've got Madison Tromler and we've got Kaitlyn McCarthy, who have both broken their share of stories. And when I say break, I'm not really talking about spot news. We've talked on this podcast before about, something happens and you rush out and you break news. I'm talking more in-depth stuff that took some work to get done. And you know it's important, you know it's a big deal, you know that people need to know about this, but somehow, whether it's because you got a tip or because, I don't know, somebody, it's for whatever reason, maybe they're working on it too, but they haven't gotten to it, no other outlet has reported what you're about to report. So let's start with just how that happens. A lot of times it's, you get a phone call and you check something out, right?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, we'll get a tip, and it could be a tip, or we read something online, but I feel like in a lot of our situations, it has been someone calling our newsroom, and then, that's kind of your first sort of source of information, and then it needs to be verified. So from there, you are going, whatever it is that they're saying, we are going to request every and all types of records that we can that would confirm what it is that they're saying, the investigation we're doing. So I think it just comes down to having multiple different sources, and these sources don't have to be just a person, but documentation that confirms and proves what it is that we are reporting. So when you have those multiple, because you can confirm something in different ways. Sure. you could have, there's different types of records or agencies that could address a situation, and for some reason coming to mind right now is when we're doing stories looking into consumers concerned about not getting a product they paid for. Consumer stories, you have the AG's office, but you also have the Better Business Bureau. And although the AG's office may not confirm some sort of an investigation or something, they have complaints on their website. There's the Better Business Bureau, and then there may be a lawsuit online pertaining to that situation. So then we're in a place where we have three different types of confirmation that could align with what someone else is saying. So I think just, that's a good way to feel confident when maybe another news organization is not reporting about this or doesn't know about it.
Well, and I say that because, a lot of what's out there is just kind of everybody reports on it. I'd say the bulk of news is just either an event that happened or it's been out there and maybe it originates in a newspaper or something and you go, oh yeah, that's important. We're going to do our own version of that. I mean, a lot of news outlets do sort of feed off of what's in the news flow. And so you're pretty confident that what you're reporting is accurate because you're not out there on a limb. What's it feel like when you are?
So, yeah, I mean, sometimes it all depends. When you get that phone call, you have to make sure that you get all of your sources. You have to know that it's a good source before you move forward with a story. So it's kind of can be really difficult before you put something on the air. It's important to, triple check, quadruple check, especially when it comes to a story like that. I know that stories that I've broke that were like kind of a first time situation, I will watch it 5 or 6 times before it even goes on the air. It really is just something that I want to make sure everything is correct, because I don't want something to go on TV that isn't 100% accurate.
And, as a news manager, obviously, I want us to break big stories every day. I want us to be the leading news organization that I feel we are. Mm-hmm. But you also, in addition to being, there's this sort of this dual thing that you wrestle with where you're really happy you're the first one who has it. But there's also a part of you going, why is no one else reporting this? Is there a reason? Is there something I'm missing here that makes this maybe not even wrong, but is it unfair for some reason? Is there an angle I'm missing that people are standing down when we're not?
I think that's the same reason when we see a news article, from a different news organization, the same reason we wouldn't rely solely on seeing someone's article and thinking like, oh, and believing that information is 100% correct. And of course, if we see something we don't have, we're going to act on it. But I think the same reason we wouldn't give a lot of power to some other news organization's article is the same reason we should feel confident in the work that we do. And I think to your point earlier, really quick, when you said when there's, your daily news stories, and I thought it was interesting when I first started, I'd be like, oh, all the stations have the same leads. And I'm like, oh, it's like interesting how they do have they think the same. They're like, okay, this is the lead. It doesn't always happen, but usually day to day you'll find, okay, they may lead with similar stories if there's big breaking news events. But whenever there's breaking news and something that actually I remember our former news director, Mona Alexander, she talked about this is, you're not, when there's a breaking news situation, you're going to go out and you're going to get what you can. You're not going to be able to cover it all. And you're going to see that different news organizations maybe focus in on something specific in that situation. Like with the downtown explosion, you may have had, one station was really focusing on the residents. The other station was really trying to get to the information as to how the firefighters responded or something. Sure. That's just an example. And from there, I think over time, one news organization, they were able to build a rapport or get some information and maybe build a source that could lead them somewhere else down the road. And I think a lot of times, stories that we end up doing could come from a breaking news situation where it makes us question something and it leads somewhere else. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
It can kind of feather out to its own thing. So I think in a lot of ways, it makes sense that when we're doing an investigation or trying to break something, that they don't have it because it just wasn't something that they even were tipped off about. They didn't focus on it from the start or whatever it may be.
Well, you mentioned the realty explosion. That day there were different angles on the breaking news, but in the aftermath of it, there were a lot of angles that we pursued that I saw some of them turn up some places. I saw others not turn up. I mean, I think you both have had experiences in the aftermath of that, leaning on city officials, asking questions about, for instance, contracts with the building's owner and why the city was in business with them and who was working in the basement. And those questions were out there for everybody. But there was a point where we were really kind of beating a drum, very confident that this was an important angle when others were not pushing it as hard. But you knew the building did explode. You knew there were contracts. So we could make that decision that we were just editorially deciding that this was more important than maybe another outlet might think it is, or maybe they're pursuing something that they think is more important than we do. But there are others where sometimes they don't do it for I don't know what reason. Like, Kaitlyn, recently you did a story a couple of weeks ago about a potential sale of the Southern Park Mall. Now, this is a big deal if it happens, and we had the paperwork to back it up, and we had the sources to back it up, and we know the story is accurate. I haven't seen anybody else report on it even still. We have public officials who have spoken up, angry about the fact that they want to be more involved in the process. Now, I haven't taken a single call from anybody saying, you got that all wrong. I'm confident we had all that information right. But did you expect the next day that at least a newspaper would have written an article?
I would expect something by now. I know it's that huge question of just why? Why isn't it, on other sources? Of course, there's a little bit to you that makes you a little concerned, but at the same time, it's accurate. Like we've double, triple checked the work. I know that was a group effort in the newsroom. This was something we were working on for a long time. I'm not sure. I have been checking too to see if that is something that other sources would put on there, but I don't know. It's something that I know we felt was really important to follow closely and that we decided to pursue that.
I think what was surprising for me is, so the initial story was very hard to get. It took working multiple sources. It took paperwork that was not in the public sphere. It was hard to do the original story.
Oh, yeah.
But we did a follow-up story the next day with public officials. Now, if I'm just putting my news manager hat on, if I saw another outlet with that story, while we were working on how to get it, I would see an easy path to get on the scoreboard by going to the public officials and simply saying that there are reports out there that this is happening and they want answers. And I did expect that.
Yeah.
I was surprised that didn't, and I don't know why it didn't happen. I can't put myself in some, and I'm not being critical. But that's the feeling, that's the roller coaster you go through. Is it's a win to have the story. It's important to everybody. We serve the public. They need to know this. This is an important part of the Boardman community and Mahoning County as a whole. But when you don't get them to, I think about, and this is a reference that predates myself, and it certainly predates almost everybody down in the newsroom. But one of the most famous breaking of a stories in American history is the Watergate story. And if you ever read All the President's Men or even see the movie or know anything about that, the way that went down, it was a series of stories. And on several occasions, Ben Bradley was the editor of the Washington Post, would have to call Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein in and say, if what you guys have is so accurate and so important, why is no one else doing this? Why don't I read this in the New York Times? Why am I not seeing, Walter Cronkite talk about this?
Okay, so I'm gonna just be very proud of our newsroom, because I think that we are unafraid to do stories that may have a risk, that may upset someone. I think newsrooms, and I think a lot of newsrooms pick and choose their battles, and I'm not going to speculate why any newsroom, why they didn't do Watergate or why they weren't doing the Southern Park Mall story and whatnot. But I don't know what sort of relationships there are or what sort of reasonings that we have no idea. And obviously with something like Watergate, I think there does have to be a sense of confidence and bravery when you are a local news organization that does have a lot of at stake. A lot of people know each other here in Youngstown, and I don't know who's working with who or what, but I think I'm proud that we aren't afraid to do a story that may upset someone, or maybe in the future might make it hard for us to get a call back from that person. I believe a lot of organizations pick and choose battles thinking, well, sure, I don't want to burn my source. I don't want to burn a bridge with someone. But, I think over time, though, what we do, which is we're not burning, but we're maybe doing a story that someone may not like, but it's the truth. But I think over time you do gain their respect when they see that you're doing it properly.
I think that's true, and so that builds on, it's not just burning a source. Sometimes it's that the burning a source, I usually think of like, this person's been good to me with information and now this is going to make them look bad and I'll burn them. But sometimes it's a more complicated web than that too. Sometimes it's not the person that I'm getting the info from, or it's not who it's about, but rather who does or doesn't like that person. And I might fall out of their good graces if a story makes someone that they don't like look good, or vice versa. And that just, to my mind, that can't be a consideration.
Right, that can't be the factor in how you do news, or else then that is controlling the narrative of news, if you're allowing the thoughts of someone else to control whether or not you're going to do a story.
Oh, absolutely. That could change whether or not what kind of stories you're going to do. If you're just going to be doing stories that people are just throwing at you and you're not looking into stuff, then how are we going to get that news out properly? I think that's really important. And like you said, I am really happy with our station that we do dig into stuff like that.
Another one that you've followed a lot, Kaitlyn, is the sale of the hospitals in Trumbull County to a group called Insight. And we're learning a lot about Insight, and we have no preconceived notions about what kind of owners or operators they are going to be. But I do know, and there was some vindication, that we were not being unfair, because we did some early stories where we spoke to a national journalist, we spoke to some local public officials who had raised some concerns about their relationship with the landlord, Medical Properties Trust, and whether or not there was any reason to think that this could be similar to the situation with Stewart. Well, that was one that no one was following us on. They really weren't reporting on the background of Insight, and a few of us did. And I'm talking the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's not as though they have this horrible track record. They don't. But there are questions, particularly pertaining to their relationship with MPT, and we've delved pretty deep into that. Well, now we find out that there are some job cuts that they've made that blindsided, I think, a lot of people, and other outlets had to get on board with that. And I think that because of our willingness to go out in front of looking into everything that we might need to be watching for, our audience was better informed and probably less surprised that this is the way it's going right now. And that doesn't mean they're not going to call people back. It doesn't mean they're not going to hire more people. It does not mean they're going to be bad owners. I'm not going to sit here and say that because I don't know yet. But it means that we needed to begin documenting things right at the beginning and not take people immediately at their word. I know I just said a lot about that, but I mean, your experience working on that, we were not unfair. We talked to people who were critical, but you spoke to the chief medical officer more than once.
Oh, I did, yeah. And I think a lot of times with those stories too, when you go in the beginning and you're speaking to them and trying to get those answers, I mean, we don't know a lot at that point and we're trying to piece it together. That's a high risk, high reward when you're putting something like that out, obviously. We see that there's stories like this now, good thing that we followed back, but, there is always that fear of, what if the story doesn't have, a follow-up or something like that. But also saying that, of course, it always is, a great thing to have a good person, for the hospital. So I guess it is kind of like trying to balance that out and everything like that.
Now, Madison, you mentioned some of the consumer stories also, and we'll get into some of the investigatory stuff, but you've done several stories where it's just been, we get a call from somebody who says, I paid for such and such a service, and I never got it. And I would say that a lot of those calls really don't go anywhere. It's one kind of personal dispute between two people. But every now and then, there's been a lot more to it, and I haven't seen people follow it. I'm thinking of things like there was, the Attorney General's office went after a Warren shed company. There was, and that was fairly straightforward and well documented, but you had to go get the documentation. But sometimes they're very complicated, right? There were complaints about Burt Decor that are not nearly as cut and dry as the people calling to complain think they are.
Right. And yeah, and those stories, all of these stories require a lot of time, resources, and work to look into, depending on what it is. And so I think for us, we might be doing a story that's in reality affecting, 100 people in the area. I don't know an exact number, but I think, I think we take the time, even if it's, a situation, but that's newsworthy. People need to know about a local business doing something like that if they're, allegedly, if they're not getting people their sheds on time, for example. But I think
what the reasoning is, right? They both, in both of the cases I just mentioned, they had at least reasonable arguments for their reasonable defenses.
Oh, right. Yeah, of course. And including, of course, their defenses. And I think that there may be, just to your point that you were talking about earlier, maybe another organization just is like, oh, do people really care about that? I just imagine maybe that's what they're thinking, but I think people do. They do want to hear about that. And I think we spend time on things that maybe, consumer stories that may be affecting a certain amount of people in the area, but it just seems like maybe other news organizations, like for example, the hospital stuff with Insight and everything, maybe in their mind, they were just waiting for something to break, waiting for something to really come out that's really, they're going to be like, oh, this is really going to, with the workers and stuff. Whereas like, there's probably a good amount of people though that are holding on to the news every day, wanting to know more about that, but the general public, so I think just we have more of a in-depth approach of thinking about viewers on a bigger scale. Does that make sense?
It does. It's a proactive approach as opposed to just reactive.
Yeah, right.
But there's also a question of whether or not it's fair, and that's something that we wrestle with. Is it if you're talking about, take Insight for example. At the time we were doing stories looking into their background, you could probably make the argument that that's not fair. They haven't done anything to anybody here yet, so give them a chance. And that's a reasonable position to take. But I also think it's a reasonable position to take to just make sure that you're fair in your reporting. It doesn't mean you hold back. It means you make sure that they have an opportunity to respond. You raise whatever concerns there are, and that's why we've done stories with people raising concerns about them. But we also did a story that was entirely just their chief medical officer answering those concerns, right? And it was so we were. You can do. There's a fair way to do it.
Yeah, I think a lot of news sources, and I mean, I can't speak for them, but I think a lot of it is that they're afraid, to make those assumptions about something. So they'll, jump on it maybe a little bit later than we want to follow it maybe from the beginning. And that's, I think, what we were doing. Particularly in this case, we were trying to follow it from the start. So when more comes along, we learn more information about it and we can kind of just have follow-ups. And I don't think it always goes down to, like you said, how it is on social media or how people react to it. You really want to put that information out there and get as much out there as possible so that people know that you are, trying to get as much information to them and they understand.
Yeah, and sometimes I feel like maybe in their minds, maybe a news organization or I don't know, maybe there could be someone out there with the belief of like, well, I'm not going to make a problem that's not there. Create something that's not there, whatever. But I think of it as, how many people are watching and thinking, what is this company?
Yes.
What the natural curiosity, I think, of reporting and being fair. It's not us, ever trying to create something. It's the true curiosity when we have this, big hospital all of this impact that it caused in the area, and this new company's coming in. Of course, anyone in the area is going to want to know about that company.
Right. So if something affects the lives of the viewers, or could potentially, you really want to try and put yourself in their minds. If I'm wondering this, I don't. None of us are as unique as we'd like to think we are. If I was able to wonder it and it doesn't necessarily even directly affect me, then there are lots of people that are wondering this. So don't I have some obligation to provide them information they need before something good or bad happens and not just after the fact? This is not us telling the audience what happened to them. It's also telling you, hey, these are the things you need to look out for.
Yes. And I feel like it's like, I think about people watching the news and the people that say, the news should really do a story about this. That's the kind of stories we do. We look into things things that people at home are like, why don't they look into this? Why don't they cover this? Why aren't they covering that? I think, we do, a really good job of looking into the things that that people are wondering about, that they have curiosities about, and I think that kind of journalism can really help with distilling or with misinformation in the future. It can help with people's thoughts in the future and everything. And I think that's just a good way of doing journalism
It also helps lay the groundwork for where things are later on and allow you to do more in-depth reporting. For instance, an investigation that I'll go back to, and we've done several of them, but one that I can think of is of course our investigation into the money and how it was spent in the Youngstown City Schools under the previous superintendent/CEO. Now, proactively, Madison, you, me, Robert, we were able to lay out where lots and lots of money went and lay out the questions about the propriety of the spending, and that took that hard work on the front end. Well, subsequently, there have been major developments, including an FBI investigation into all of that we didn't have the benefit of that when we did the story originally. So now, whenever any development comes of that, whether it be a question about spending at the school board, or if there is something that comes out of the FBI investigation, we have context we can bring to the reporting that people who didn't do that work early on can't do. And so now we're able to serve everybody better now with a development. Our reactive story in the future will have so much more detail and nuance because of the hard work we did on the front end. But when you first hit the air with those stories, I don't ever air an investigation and watch it and celebrate. I watch it and I go, oh God, please tell me we didn't miss anything? You're really, really nervous. It's a nerve-wracking thing.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I think for me, I mean, yeah, of course, and you're of course the manager and the boss, and you guys are obviously going to be like, okay, I hope everything's right. Yes, I do. I think, I mean, it goes into the process and the accuracy, and I think for me, and I kind of thought about this before, is, if another news organization doesn't have this, well, okay, well, I'm gonna verify it 3 different ways. And, if it was something that everyone was covering, they probably have different ways that they're reporting on it. And, so I think it just comes down to confirmation and accuracy, and not just confirming something because an official says it, or because a piece of paper says it, or even a document says it.
Too. Documents are
Even
not
if it's
necessarily true. I mean,
yeah. And they misspeak. And if someone says number, and I've been in situations all the time where it's out of pure intentions, but someone misspeaks, you have to verify everything that you read. So there's that. And I was going to say something I totally forgot, but when we were talking about the Youngstown investigation, I just loved what you said about the context thing. Because how many times have we done a story where there ends up being such a backstory to it?
Right.
But we put ourselves in a position where we know the backstory and we have the context, whereas, another news organization that hasn't covered this at all, and there's some big development, they're starting from square one, and their viewers may not have past web stories to refer to, or just in general, the context that they're able to lay out in a couple of sentences.
Well, with regard to the Youngstown school story, there was the day of the FBI raids, the FBI put out a tip line for anybody who knew of any potential kickbacks in that school district related to vendor contracts. Now, if that was the first I'd heard of anything going on there that was questionable, I got to put out there that the FBI says that they're investigating kickbacks, and we'll keep following it because I don't know what they're talking about. Well, we already had laid a groundwork for the fact that there were questions about contracts. Now, that didn't mean we could say that those were the contracts the FBI was talking about. FBI is not saying that. We don't know that. But we do know already that we have previously reported that there are questions about these contracts. So as long as you word it carefully and fairly, you're able to say, we don't know what they're referring to, but we do know questions have been raised about, and then and be able to refer to the work that you've done.
Yeah, and just one other thing I want to add is, it ensures more accurate reporting, I believe, in the future, because we're also learning the process of something. We're learning the process naturally, and I notice over time, I'm like, oh, this is how it worked in this situation. And, you're learning as you report more instead of just waiting for the final, straw.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I've only done a few investigative pieces because I'm a little bit, a new reporter here. So trying to kind of get that together, I'm still trying to figure out the best way to do that. But even just in those few that I've done, it's easy to kind of find that there is that almost like a routine, or figuring out a way of using other stories to help you develop newer stories.
You've done, let me just say that she's done a lot.
Madison's a huge Kaitlyn fan.
I'm a fan, and I still feel new. Honestly, I've only been, been doing this for a few, I still feel green. But you have for what did you start, a year ago? Or not even.
Yeah, I think I started reporting in
and I think I'd like to think that after I started doing things, maybe now we have more confidence in the young people and stuff. But you have done so many investigations since you started.
Thank you.
And
it's hard. It's hard, and there's stuff that you have to learn as you go. Though I think was the point that you were getting at, and that you started laying out, is that those. You'll make mistakes as you go, and that's why we have to work together, because a mistake can hurt your credibility far more than, a simple mistake in an otherwise flawless story tarnishes the whole story, because your credibility's on the line, and that simple mistake might not affect the rest of the story, but it makes the people that the story's about say, no, you can't trust them. Look what they got wrong there. And it really, really hurts, even if it's something as simple as, an inartfully chosen word or piece of video, or or a source that you use that it turns out was compromised, which actually brings me to another piece, another element in all of this, which is that we're very close to an election, and people come out of the woodwork with allegations against political adversaries during election season. And I do know that a lot of news organizations will just flatly say, it's simply too close to an election and I'm not getting sucked into that game. And by the way, that's respectable. I can respect that. But also, sometimes the issue is serious enough that it does require attention, and you have to weigh all of this. And we've done 2 recently. Kaitlyn, you did one, and then one that I worked on with another reporter that did have a direct bearing on an election and had what could be potentially major red flags. Now, the one that I'll talk about the one that I worked on because it was a couple weeks ago, and then we'll talk about the one that you just did this week. So the one that I worked on had to do with the Mahoney County prosecutor's race, and there were new allegations and not new allegations, but a call for a special prosecutor to be appointed to investigate some alleged conduct on the part of one of the candidates. But here's the problem. It's right before an election. The allegations are not new. They go back several months. And the people bringing this call for a special prosecutor both have direct personal conflicts of interest here. In this particular case, one is an ex-husband and one is a disgruntled former coworker. That's a hard one. I understand when others may not have done that story, and we were not the only ones who did it. Others did do it, but others did not also. It was a tough call. Yeah. So we have to weigh, okay, right off the bat, there are strikes against this. The personal relationships are a big strike against it. The fact that it's so close to an election are strikes against it. The fact that the allegations are really not brand new, so they have been out there. That's 3 big marks against it right away. So why'd we do it? Well, because if I remove those factors, does what I have left stand on its own? And in this particular case, the allegations had been corroborated by others that didn't have the same direct personal conflict. They were unresolved when they first came about. The call for a special investigation could have come at any time. The fact that it was coming so close to an election almost certainly was politically motivated to some extent. But we can lay that out there. Do not hide any of that. These people have conflicts. This is close to an election. They could have brought this out before then. But is it important, and is it something the voters need to know? Is it something that the people have a right to know? And in that particular case, we decided that we did not know if there was wrongdoing, but an independent agency weighing in was not in and of itself damaging, and it would be more transparency. We sided with, the fact that somebody's calling for more transparency on these issues. And notice, I'm being careful even as I talk about it now that you could figure out what story I'm talking about. I said which race, but I'm not rehashing all the details because I'm not trying to be exploitative with it. But that was why we made the decision to do the story. Now, Kaitlyn, you just did a story yesterday, not the same circumstances, but a lot of the same concerns. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so it kind of was a similar, circumstance. It involved Nikki Frenchko, and she was asking for a special prosecutor as well in her case. And this all dates back to in 2022 when she was arrested at the meeting. But this was more going towards, she thought there was a conflict of interest in her newest case. So she asked for that, but we wanted to make sure to cover that and have that in there. And I know that was kind of a debate that the newsroom was having in the morning on whether or not that was something we wanted to cover, but we did make the decision that was something to move forward with, but we did make sure to say the timeline of when it was.
And to fill in the blanks a little in case anybody, because I mean people locally know the people that we're talking about and they know the case, but this is on the internet, people do watch from out of state.
Yes,
they
right.
might not know. Is that this is a case where back in 2022, Trumbull County Commissioner was arrested during a meeting accused of unlawfully disrupting it. Those charges were dismissed. She files suit. A judge sides with her that her rights were violated. And in the course of that civil suit, there was a preservation of evidence order where text messages involving the sheriff and other commissioners were told to be preserved. They were unable to produce those messages. They no longer existed. And so now, 2 years later, since the arrest, she's asking for a special prosecutor to be appointed to investigate the potential that there was tampering with evidence. This has been playing out in civil court, but her position is that that's a criminal investigation also. So we did report on it because if I take the names out of there, and if I take the proximity to the election out of there, the sheriff's office is conflicted because they were involved in the arrest. The county, because it involves other commissioners, is arguably conflicted or could be conflicted. The Warren Police Department is not directly involved, except that the Warren Law Director is the brother of one of the commissioners that's accused, so there's a potential conflict there. So I've said all of that without any of the names involved, so all of the emotion is stripped out of it. Does that sound like at least a reasonable call that an independent body ought to look into it? Well, you can agree or disagree, but it does not sound unreasonable, and it is dealing with elected officials with a lot of power and in the course of their official duties. And that's why we made the decision to do that. Now, if I plug the names in, everybody involved is a lightning rod in local politics. They all have friends, they all have enemies, they all have networks of friends and networks of enemies. And of course, the allegation could be made that anytime you report anything that one of them wants reported, the others can say you're only doing that as a favor and it's unfair. But that's why we stripped away all of those other things and just said, what's the core issue here? There are plenty of times where people call us near an election with lesser issues, and we don't touch them with a 10-foot pole because it's just damaging info about somebody in their private life, say. In fact, I can think of one right now that we're still weighing, but it's an old allegation against a candidate, and it's documented, but not completely documented. And so far, we have not touched it, and I don't rule out that we wouldn't, but I need more than what I have right now.
Right, like a legitimate, call to action, her calling on a special prosecutor, something, I mean, that is newsworthy, and let the viewers decide that it's politically motivated. Let them, if that's the case, that's the story. 2 days, or 5, whenever the election is now, a week away from the election, and I'm just using as an example, a commissioner calling for a special prosecutor, or, just days before the election, they're calling a prosecutor candidate, into question in Mahoning. Let the viewer decide if there's some sort of political motivation, and, you're just covering what's happening.
And by the way, make sure that you do that prominently, in both of the election-related ones that we've just talked about. In the writing process, the mention of the election, I ended up deciding upon, reviewing the script and working with the reporters that needed to be moved up way higher. I mean, it needs to be right out of the gate. It is this close to an election and both of these people are running. And these allegations are coming from people who don't like them.
And you'd be surprised when viewers may have a totally different response than what you would expect. And their takeaway from that story is like, oh my gosh, and I'm not, saying my opinion here, but someone may be like, oh my gosh, like really? And they may actually kind of reason a little bit with maybe the person that these people are making an allegation about. You let them decide how they feel about the actions and beliefs of the people in the story. We're just reporting what happened.
Do you think sometimes organizations stand down on a story based upon, and I'm not saying that we do this, but I will admit that sometimes there's a temptation to do this because we're human beings, that sometimes it's simply that we don't like the people who are bringing the information to us. I'll be completely honest. Sometimes there are sources who are not pleasant. They're not, not everybody that we deal with. In fact, a lot of people we deal with, I've spent over the course of almost 16 years in this newsroom, I've spent hours on the phone with people who are not always, sometimes they're downright combative, sometimes they taunt you. I get emails from people who are downright condescending, and yet their information might be news. But do you think sometimes there's a temptation to say, Not from them. I don't want to hear it.
And I think a lot of it is, for me, how credible are they, and do they have a pretty good understanding of the news? Do they watch the news? Do they have a good? Because you know how sometimes people
Yes.
bring you a story and
They don't understand.
I'm like, we don't have any of the records to back up what you're just saying. You know what you're saying, and they just, you know. So are they credible? Are they? You know, I think for me that, because I think, yeah, if I don't like someone, I don't think I would feel like if I feel they're a credible person and they have a clear understanding of what makes that thing a story, whatever it is they're saying, I think it would be hard to not, you know,
Please
put it in.
understand, I'm not talking
Yeah.
about specifically you. I'm
Right.
talking about just the human. Like this is part of what the
Right.
roller coaster we go through. So it's more globally. Like, I mean, we're not talking necessarily about journalists in this market
Right.
or us personally. Just any journalist anywhere. Do you think sometimes there are stories that don't get told because the person raising the issue is just kind of
Yeah.
a pain?
They get dismissed. People get dismissed.
And I think people sometimes, I mean, those really go in depth, some of these stories too. And I think that's another thing. That's a lot of work to put into those stories.
Yes.
If it is a complicated story, we don't want to just dismiss it. But you know, there might be another news source that will dismiss a story, and that's just how it is. And that is honestly human nature. It's like, would you want to put this many hours and this much time into something when in reality you know that it's going to take forever to do it, and you have to make sure to double, triple check your sources and just be extra careful.
And you also have to take every phone call or every tip for what it's worth, because I've also had stories that have panned out from people who call all the time, and 9 times out of 10 they're just talking to hear themselves. I mean, there are people who, you know, there was maybe a story that we did on them sometime in the 90s, and they call the newsroom all the time, and half the time it's to talk about national news, and half the time it's to talk about their personal lives, and then every now and then
Yeah.
they were somewhere, they heard something, and you're not going to use this phone call as the basis. But if I dismiss that person because most of the time they're wasting my time by calling, I might miss something. I can think of one in particular who was just enough of a sort of a gadfly that just sort of showed up places and asked a lot of questions. And most of the time, there was a big disconnect between what was news and what they were interested in. But then one time, they were at this very obscure meeting and found out that somebody was in a lot of trouble for something very egregious. And they called to tell me what they heard. Now, I can't report it based on them calling, but it was accurate, and we were the only ones who had the story.
And I was telling you just earlier that I feel like a big strength that I think all reporters should have, and hopefully we all have this strength, but definitely that you have, is that you do not treat every call the same. You do listen, and you guys make sure that, you know, even if this person's called a million times before, you can't just treat every call or every story the same, you know?
I've done
And I
my
think-
share of hanging up on people, but only after you've crossed the line and I know that you're not gonna.
Right, but I
have a
think,
story.
and to your point earlier, you know, do you think, when you asked, do you think people, they just don't like someone, but I think that could even just be like, do you think that people take calls and they're just like, it's
That's true too. Yeah, this is because we're humans. We're humans and we're
Yeah.
very, very busy. We're processing a lot of information, and sometimes it can be as simple as they're too chatty and they're taking a long time to get to the point, and you don't have that time and they do. And how long do you give them? How long do you give them? And I give them probably more than most, but man, sometimes it leads somewhere really important.
Right.
So I'm not cutting
Yeah.
them off. Now, if they start, you know, being abusive or being bigoted or something like that, well, then I'm going to end the call. I'm not going to give you the time of day once you've shown your hand. But, you know, if you're, say, you know, just, I've been watching your station for all these years, and what's so-and-so like, and I really, how about the weather? And, well, they may be heading somewhere important and they're just being friendly. I can't, you know, I might have to tell you that I'm late for a meeting. Can we hurry this
Right.
up? But I can't just brush you off. You still have
Right.
value.
Right. And I'm thinking about, you know how we were talking about, obviously, how we've done so many stories that maybe no other news organization has done, and we're like, why didn't they do it? I wonder if sometimes they didn't take a call early on, maybe that person called us both or called, all the papers and all the places. And, there's that moment where they're like, oh my God, like I ignored that call,
Well, but then that's another thing though, is that we're all human, so we have pride. But if you get beat on an important story, you have to swallow that. You serve your audience. Competition exists in this industry, and it needs to. But ultimately, we serve the public. I say that because the Youngstown Schools story is an example where one of many sources we had on this, but the original one, started his conversation with me by saying, I'm going to give you guys a chance here, but I've called every other, and he rattled off a list of outlets
and
that he had
we're the
called,
last, and then
and nobody was listening to us. Nobody was listening to him. And, so right now, like even the pride, the hell did you call us last for? I could have been offended right there. But
I'm like, but they called us.
Now we routinely get calls saying, I saw you did this story and I didn't see anybody else do that. So that gets back to a point from earlier in this conversation, which is do you worry about burning sources? But you cultivate new ones by doing good work, which is another reason. I mean, look, if I see a competing outlet do a story that I wish we had, and I think it's important to the public, there are times where you say, oh man, I wish we had that one, but it's not of crucial importance. There are other times where you go, man, I think we just have to do it.
Yes.
We just have to do it.
Yes, that's our job. It doesn't, our job is to report the news. Just because, and if they're thinking, oh well, if they're doing the story, then we don't have to. Like we're not the same organization, So if something's happening, it doesn't matter. I'm firmly in the belief that you still cover the happening news. You're not going to chase after every interview or every angle they said, but you're going to cover it.
And by the way, please understand to the viewers of this, I'm not saying any of this as a criticism of any other news organization's thought process. I'm more like, these are the things that you think about when you're ahead on a story, though, because it's really born out of no matter how meticulously you've done on a story, you worry that you could miss something. And there is a sort of strength in numbers when everybody follows, and when they don't, you simply start to try and analyze or psychoanalyze, well, why might they not have? Or there could be good reasons, there could be bad reasons, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. And we do this all the time. And so it's not just to, sort of toot our own horn, and it's certainly not meant as an editorial criticism of another organization, because it's hard to do what we do.
We all miss stories.
It is hard to do what we do. So I just wanted to make that very, very clear, because I'm sure that there are times where we do stories and there are other editors or news directors who watch and they go, I can't believe they did that, and here are the reasons we wouldn't do that. This podcast exists to sort of just give you a peek behind the curtain of the thought that goes into news, with the understanding that there are reasonable minds who could make different decisions than the ones we make.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, just to your point, we've missed things all the time, but the whole point of this is, not all the time.
Time.
I don't know why I said that. I'm just saying, this wasn't a criticism, but we're human. Of course we're gonna miss certain, things sometimes. But I think, just the idea that I like that we cover things with keeping the curiosity of the viewers in mind and continuing to follow it. And I just do really think that helps you build to be a stronger reporter and understand how to cover different types of situations, for example, with the hospitals or with school spending, whatever it may be, or with consumer stories. Like, it's different when you're doing a story because they have moved forward and filed a lawsuit to sue a local business than covering it from the beginning, where actually in the beginning that story even did, as far as I know from the people that reach out to us, that's continued to help people get their merchandise that they needed. And I'm talking about a specific the shed story situation, so there was a benefit to that. But I just really think that it helps build your knowledge in the future. And also, because I think you made such a good point when you said it builds sources it builds sources as we go, but also I think builds a trust with the viewers when they see that you are continuing to follow something even if another station isn't, and that's what makes people call, but also makes viewers trust that you're going to be, covering things the most that you can.
Right. We have to trust our sources, but our sources have to trust us too, and our audience has to trust us too. Kaitlyn, no pressure. Final word.
No, I think that pretty much that the whole idea of this is that we're not just in this to make friends with our sources here. We're here to give fair and accurate information out there. That's our number one goal. So that's really, I think, when everything boils down, that's the main goal that we're really trying to complete here. And that's why we put so much thought and effort into all of these kind of stories that we do. And I know that our station likes to go really in depth into things. And that's why it's not, if we burn a bridge, we have to burn a bridge. I mean, if it's going to put out fair information,
but
do it lightly. Exactly.
So if you would like to help us get fair and information out there and accurate information out there that we don't know about, because as we've said many times today, we are all human and we are not all knowing, then you can always contact us. Our newsroom is 330-744-8821. You can email us at news@wfmj.com. You can comment on this video. Always please like and subscribe to the Outcue and to the WFMJ YouTube page. You can reach us at watchdog@wfmj.com. You can reach us on our Facebook page. You can reach us a number of ways. So please, don't be shy. We will listen to you. We're not that, we're very busy, but we will hear you out. And if I say, hey, listen, I'm late for a meeting, I swear I am, but I will still listen to you.
It's true.
And until then, next week, we'll see you on the verge of an election, and we will most likely be discussing what goes into planning for that sort of thing. But until then, this has been the Outcue.